Christmas is normally the time for giving and receiving presents. But on Christmas Eve 1914, the good people of Dover in Kent received a very unwelcome present. A present that would make a little piece of history. Just before 11 o'clock in the morning, a lone German plane broke through the clouds above the town. Oberleutnant Alfred von Prondzynski peered down at Dover Castle and the harbour below. And then carefully, he lifted the single bomb that he'd carried between his knees from their base in Belgium and lifted it over the side and let go. He'd just made history, dropping the first ever bomb on Britain from the air. Unlike civilian populations in, say, the American Civil War or the Franco-Prussian War, Britain's 19th century colonial wars had happened far, far away. It was the Boer or the Maori or the Pathan civilians, to name just a few, who had a home front, not the British. And initially, when war was declared in August 1914, it seemed to be heading in a similar direction. The British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, departed for the continent, and by the end of the month, with the Battle of Mons, families were starting to grieve for their loved ones. But it was all happening over there. For the townspeople of Dover, however, over there was just 26 miles away, across the English Channel, and the danger signs were already there, if not fully appreciated. 5 years before the war broke out, Louis Blériot had become the first person to fly an aeroplane across the Channel from France. So the Channel was not quite the moat it had always seemed. Whilst Orville and Wilbur Wright had only conducted the very first successful powered flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft in 1903, all the belligerents from the outset of the First World War were keen to harness the opportunities that flying over armies and obstacles, like the English Channel, presented. However rudimentary those early aircraft, by the winter of 1914, all the belligerents, bar the British, had staged modest attacks on each other's accessible towns and cities. The German Kaiser had even offered a prize to the first man to fly across the Channel and bomb England. On the 21st of December 1914, the crew of a German aircraft decided to give it a go. Flying from occupied Belgium, they arrived in the skies above the port of Dover in Kent and proceeded to drop 2 bombs. However, the Kaiser's prize remained unclaimed, as both bombs fell harmlessly in the sea to the west of Admiralty Pier. 3 days later, on Friday the 24th of December 1914, the same crew, in a different plane, decided to pay a return visit to Dover and give the English an early Christmas present. Members of Seaplane Unit No. 1, they'd taken off from an airfield just outside the occupied Belgian port of Zeebrugge in a Friedrichshafen FF-29, referred to by the Germans as a float plane. It was one of 2 FF-29s at the base and had only come into service in the previous month. In the rear seat of the plane was the pilot, Ensign Ludwig von Frankenberg, and in front of him sat his observer, Lieutenant Alfred von Prondzynski. Prondzynski came from an aristocratic Silesian family, steeped in the Prussian military tradition. His grandfather had risen to the rank of Field Marshal in the Prussian army, fighting in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Whilst Alfred was an ardent royalist and patriotic German, he was also a keen Anglophile and spoke good English, having spent several holidays in Brighton when he was younger. Crossing the English Channel, they made landfall near Deal and turned south towards Dover. The port was protected by rudimentary anti-aircraft guns, which were yet to be fired, as their previous raid had been so fast and ineffective the guns hadn't even had time to respond. They'd catch those guns unprepared this morning too, as they approached from the landward side of the town and used the clouds for cover. At around 10:45 in the morning, the German float plane No. 204 saw their target. Peering out of the plane, von Prondzynski decided not to go for the docks again. This time they would go for something a lot larger, and in many ways more symbolic: the mighty Dover Castle. Built shortly after the Norman conquest and covering nearly 80 acres, it rivals Windsor as England's biggest castle. Apart from the size of the target and its symbolism, Dover Castle was also a military target in its own right. The castle controlled the gun batteries protecting the port, and from its upper floors, the Port War Signal Station controlled movements of ships in and out of this important harbour. The German FF-29 approached at a height of 5,000 feet. Now, 5,000 feet is a lot lower than the 20,000 plus feet that dogfights during the Battle of Britain were fought at. But when you're trying to literally drop a bomb onto a target with absolutely no sightings except your own eyes. 5,000 feet, which is 5 times the height of the Eiffel Tower, is challenging enough. Even more so when Alfred von Prondzynski had to physically throw the bomb over the side. He'd carried the 22-pound bomb in between his knees all the way across the channel. Now he lifted it, and as his pilot steadied the plane, he took aim and let go. Down on the ground, local solicitor Martin Mole was talking to a friend on the corner of Taswell Street and Leyburn Road. The latter road was where the successful solicitor lived with his wife, 6 children and his barrister brother. Not only was he wealthy enough to employ 4 live-in servants, according to the 1911 census, but he was a pillar of the local community, having been appointed a Baron of the Cinque Ports, which is a ceremonial role in which he attended the coronation of Edward VII. As he conversed with his friend, Mole suddenly heard a whirring sound of an aeroplane somewhere overhead. Looking up, he couldn't see the plane as it had disappeared into some cloud. What he did see, however, was an object falling towards the nearby castle. But as he watched, time seemed to slow down, and he realised it wasn't falling on the ancient castle, but towards himself. Frozen to the spot, he continued to follow its descent, and fortunately for him, it landed about 25 yards away in a garden to the rear of St James's Rectory, across the road. There followed a loud explosion, and the solicitor found himself being covered in pieces of flying earth. He had had a very lucky escape, and he wasn't the only one. The garden in which the bomb had landed was owned by local estate agent Thomas Turson. The 71-year-old Turson was in his garden when the bomb landed, blowing a crater some 9 feet long, 5 feet wide, 5 feet deep in his cabbage patch. Amazingly, the elderly gentleman emerged unscathed apart from some bruising. Next door was the rectory of the nearby St James's churches, the old medieval church and a newer Victorian one. Usually the Reverend Thomas Watkins, who had been the incumbent for about 7 years, would be holding meetings with parishioners in his home. But on this particular Friday, he had taken his family out on a trip, leaving just his cook at the residence. The explosion in the garden next door shattered the windows in houses up to 200 yards away, and inside the kitchen of the rectory, the cook was covered in flying glass, but, rather like Mr Turson next door, escaped any serious injury. 45-year-old James Banks had been born at Woodchurch, further inland in the county of Kent, but had moved to Dover when he had married his wife Edith in 1896. Now living with his family of 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, in nearby Dower Street, in the 1911 census he had stated his profession as a nurseryman and jobbing, what we would nowadays call a gardener. And it was whilst carrying out his job as a gardener that he found himself in a little piece of history. That Friday morning, James Banks was gardening at the rectory. He was perched up a tree cutting holly for Christmas decorations for the Watkins family when, as he later recalled, I heard the whir of an aeroplane. Immediately afterwards I saw a blinding light and heard a very loud explosion. The tree was struck by something, and I was thrown to the ground. Yet again, apart from some bruising, James Banks walked away from this first aerial bombardment of Britain unscathed. He died on the 30th of December 1946, aged 77, having seen out both world wars. Back on the 24th of December 1914, with their one bomb dropped on England and thus qualifying for the prize offered by the Kaiser, the Germans turned for home. By now, 2 British aeroplanes and a seaplane had been scrambled. Despite their only armament being their pilots' pistols, they set off after the FF-29, but lost the Germans in the clouds above the Channel. The explosion had been heard across the town of Dover and had caused equal amounts of excitement and panic. A survivor told the BBC in the 1980s that his mother was convinced they were being shelled by German battleships and rushed them down to their cellar. And that wasn't as over the top as you might think, because earlier that month German warships had indeed bombarded the coastal towns of Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool. That is another interesting story and I will share it with you sometime, but not today. Fragments of the bomb were mounted on a shield and presented to King George V, whilst another fragment was auctioned, raising £20 in those days' money for the Red Cross. The German duo returned to Kent the following day, Christmas 1914, this time carrying 2 bombs. However, rather than returning to Dover, they passed Sheerness and turned up the Thames, hoping to drop their bombs on the London docks. At around 1:15 p.m, They were flying over Erith, about 6 miles from their target, when they ran into anti-aircraft fire. Then they spotted planes from the Royal Flying Corps heading straight towards them. They now turned tail and a chase ensued back down the Thames estuary. In their effort to escape, they threw both bombs overboard whilst over the Isle of Grain, both falling harmlessly near a railway track. The German plane managed to evade their pursuers yet again and made it back to their base at Zeebrugge. Both the pilot, Ludwig von Frankenberg, and his observer, Alfred von Prondzynski, received the Iron Cross for their groundbreaking bombing campaign on England. On the day before the First World War ended, 10th of November 1918, Alfred von Prondzynski was hit in the face by shrapnel. It was an injury that would ultimately contribute to his death in 1932. Despite missing his target, Dover Castle, by nearly 400 yards, Alfred von Prondzynski had taken a small place in history, the first person to ever drop an aerial bomb on Britain. And Dover likewise entered the history books as the first British town ever to be bombed from the air. That raid on Christmas Eve 1914 did no damage, and it's almost comical, with bombs being tossed from planes, missing a target the size of Dover Castle, and knocking a gardener out of a tree. But it proved that a new kind of warfare was on its way, one in which civilian populations would become targets, and which the seas around Britain could no longer protect them from. As the First World War progressed, German air attacks on Britain would become more numerous, more sophisticated, and more deadly. Dover itself would be subjected to 113 air raids, with 184 bombs landing on the town. 23 inhabitants, including 3 children, would be killed, and 71 injured. The first Zeppelin airship raids took place in January 1915 on King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth, where Britain's first death from aerial bombing occurred, and then in May 1915 on London. Despite their psychological impact, the Zeppelins became vulnerable to British aircraft, and the Germans developed bombing planes to bring the war to Britain's home front. By the end of the war, 9,000 bombs had been dropped on Britain, killing 1,400 people, mainly civilians, and injuring 3,000 more. As historian Sir Max Hastings wrote, "A little more than a decade after man's first powered flight, the Blitz era was already at hand." Well, I hope you enjoyed that Christmas story with a difference. Why not watch another one of my 250 stories from British history on my channel? Oh, and don't forget to feed the beast. This is the YouTube algorithm, with a like, a comment, or a share. The more of those that it gets, the more people the video is shown to. Thanks for your support, and wherever you are in the world, I wish you a very Merry Christmas, and look forward to seeing you again very soon.